Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. Let's keep week 31 going with today's Tolkien Tuesday. Now, this series, we've been looking at the revised and expanded edition of Tolkien's letters, edited by Humphrey Carpenter and Christopher Tolkien. It's time to keep going as I share and discuss some of the new content found only in this new edition of the volume. Now, last week, we looked primarily at a couple of newly published letters that Professor Tolkien wrote to his oldest son, Michael, including a letter filled with fatherly advice, concerns about the war, and more. Today, we're going to take a look at a few letters that Tolkien wrote to his son, Christopher, from October of 1940 to February 1941. Now, again, these are each letters that are only found in the revised and expanded edition of the letters volume. And we're going to start with letter 40A from October 1940. It's about a month before Christopher's 16th birthday. He would have been away at school, and we're still almost 3 years away from his entering the Royal Air Force and that long series of letters that the professor would send him when he was in South Africa for training. All right, back to 1940, Tolkien writes to his son, "My dearest boy, it has been nice to hear fairly often and to know you are getting on well. I hope you have not had air raids lately, though it is, I must admit, very quiet at home now. It seems very lonely to me without you." Now, folks, remember this letter was written on October 20th, 1940. That's only 6 weeks into the Blitz, the aerial bombing campaign of the Luftwaffe against England. Now, you'd think that with their distance from London, the Tolkiens wouldn't have had much to deal with on that front. After all, the vast bulk of the bombs were dropped on London, not Oxford, but there were occasions, as Tolkien mentions next in his letter. "There is no particular news," he says. "I have, of course, been very busy with term business, but nothing either amusing or interesting has occurred during the week. There were several bombs on Friday night, one large and fairly near, but that is all we know about it. It woke Priscilla and Mummy up. I was not in bed just before 11 o'clock. Otherwise, things remain pretty peaceful here." Look, I got to admit, the dropping of a bomb near enough to my home to wake my family would get more mention than that in a letter, but, that's the times and the man. So back to the letter, Tolkien goes on to say that, "I find it very irksome now that blackout comes so soon to be perpetually confined to barracks after tea, as Priscilla and Mummy cannot be left alone. I never see anyone or do anything, and life seems a bit dull. But I don't want it enlivened in any warlike way." Well, Professor, we're on the same page there for sure. I don't want excitement badly enough that war would ever be welcome. But going back to that blackout bit of the letter, I think most of you likely know that during the Blitz, people were required to cover up their windows at night so that no light could escape, as that would be a help for navigational aid to enemy bombers. Now, in October of 1940, the sun would have been going down just around 6 p.m. as the country was still on British summertime. Side note / fun fact, they actually didn't go back on to standard time that year. They stayed on summertime, and then in the next spring, they moved to British double summertime from spring 1941 through 1945. All right, back to the stuff that we're actually talking about here. At least Tolkien wasn't having to cover up his windows at 4 in the afternoon, but still, this was serious, and he was genuinely stuck at home after that time. In fact, he tells Christopher in the letter that he'd managed to grab a quick pint with Lewis the morning before, but that has been the sum total of last week's amusements. Now, 3 months later, on January 26th, 1941, Tolkien wrote what is now letter number 42A to Christopher. It sounds as though his son, now 16, was a bit short on cash. Tolkien acknowledges that he gave him very little money. Your earned income, that is, and he writes 5/- for typing, he says, cannot be counted in as normal pocket money. Okay, I researched this, and first off, Christopher Tolkien was typing up chapters of The Lord of the Rings for his father. Now, as for the payment, that 5/- could mean 5 shillings no pennies or 5 pounds no shillings. A little confusing. So I used that inflation calculator to talk about the value of the pound in 1940 or 1941 in this case, to today. The 5 pounds in 1941 would be about 210 pounds today, about $267. And that seems a pretty steep price to pay your 16-year-old son for typing. But boy, the alternative is a bit ungenerous. 20 shillings to a pound means that Tolkien was paying Christopher the equivalent of today of 10 pounds or $13. Now, hopefully that's for a very short chapter. But, then again, he is also providing him pocket money. Anyway, Christopher doesn't have much, whatever the case it may be, and Tolkien knows that. So he even says, I don't really demand that normal pocket money should cover compulsory subscriptions, so I will send you another quid. Now that's £1. That's about £42 today, or $53. So he does send him a little bit of money. And of course, the professor couldn't quite leave this without adding further comment, saying, we will see how long that will last you, said every parent ever. After explaining how busy he is with work, he tells Christopher that he's praying for him and that he hopes he can make it to communion fairly often again now. But he adds a postscript that's worth looking at, and I shall read it complete without interruption or commentary. Pity you forgot Mummy's birthday, Tuesday last. Very few men, but practically all women, set great store by dates and anniversaries. It does not follow that the men are wholly in the right about it. Really, Professor? I'm sorry, I said I would do this without commentary. Anyway, Tolkien goes on to say, as a practical lesson in the way to live and conduct one's social affairs smoothly, this difference between the sexes is well worth remembering. A man can avoid a lot of trouble for himself and avoid giving much pain to others by noting it, especially in the case of wives, mothers, sweethearts, and sisters. Verb sap. No great harm done this time, but I had no father to point this out, and have learned the lesson I now pass on only by troublesome experience. I'm not going to venture to comment on the substance of this postscript, but I will explain what Tolkien meant when he wrote verb sap, both words abbreviated, so VRB, period, SAP, period. It stands for the Latin phrase verbum sat sapient est, which means a word to the wise is sufficient. Moving on now to letter 42b, written less than a week after the last letter. It's very short. Tolkien says that they've enjoyed Christopher's most recent letter, and he adds that Priscilla, who must have been ill, is now out of quarantine safely. She's also apparently been typing up The Hobbit. To what end, I'm not sure, since the book was published 3.5 years earlier, but there it is. Tolkien was too busy to go to the pantomime with Edith and Priscilla, and as he is still busy, explains to Christopher that he will write again later, which he does on February 23rd, 1941, in what is letter 42c. But we're out of time for today, so join me next Tolkien Tuesday as we come back to that letter to Christopher and another new letter to Michael as well, before moving on. And folks, that wraps it up for this week's Tolkien Tuesday. Be sure to join me again next week as we take a look at more letters and learn about a member of the Inklings you likely didn't know about. Please visit patreon.com/Tolkien Times to learn how you can support the show, get an ad-free feed, a monthly hangout with me, a bonus weekly episode, and a whole lot more. And join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Word Nerd Wednesday. If you're watching this on YouTube, you know the drill. Like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and please follow or subscribe in your podcast apps and follow at Tolkien Times on social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.